some of the ways that city staff has addressed various people who wanted to do solar, and then talk about some other green energy requests that we've had, how we work with those. And in the end, we're just hoping to have some discussion from the council, and if there's any possible code changes you'd like to consider. And got the staff memo pulled up, and in there talked about some of the options. Basically, kind of a minimalist approach that we could take, and then we could do a more elaborate approach, and I'll go through that in a little bit. But first of all, I guess I'd point out the primary solar regulations that are in our code right now were added freshly this year as part of the BPU application, where we approved the zoning ordinance text amendment to allow solar arrays in the public benefit zone. So there's only that zoning district that can have solar arrays. And just to point out a distinction of why we call them ground-mounted solar arrays, because solar can come in a lot of different applications. It can be for commercial production. It can be for a ground-mounted array that's got multiple poles and multiple panels, and those multiple panels could be for individual energy production for the property, the subject property, or in the case of BPU, could be for commercial production of energy. So there's all different types of ground-mounted applications, and then we have rooftop applications, which is what we've seen more of until the BPU application. So we have this ordinance that we've approved, so there's an opportunity for public zone properties to get a conditional use permit to do the ground-mounted arrays, which is what we saw with BPU. But in addition to that, we have allowed other solar applications. Even though the zoning ordinance is silent on it, the way staff has historically reviewed a number of different applications is to allow roof-mounted applications just with electrical permit and or a building permit, depending on the situation. But we have single-family homes that have had solar on the roof. We've had a townhome development. I think it's Sprucewood Townhomes on Grand Oaks has solar on the roof. And then the Northwood Arboretum, and then of course Cheney Fox's commercial development that's got all sorts of green energy practices in that development. They have solar in the commercial application. And with all of those, we didn't go through a separate process. I think the way staff looked at it is the rooftop applications are almost more of an architectural feature. It doesn't have near the impact to adjacent property owners if it's on a building, on a roof. Even I would say if we received an application on, say, a flat roofed commercial or industrial building, say a bigger square or rectangular building, a lot of times you can do more of an array on panels on the roof where, again, you know, the visual impact isn't quite the same as if those are, you know, like what we saw with BPU with 13 feet tall and a whole array taking up a lot of land area on the ground. So there's those considerations for what we want to consider moving forward. We also we approved one ground-mounted solar application at a single-family home. It's actually near BPU. It was one pole and panels on one pole. And when we got that application, the way we looked at that was we first asked the property owner if they were willing to work with us on making sure it's not impactful to neighboring properties. And they were more than willing to work with us, so we did consider that one application an accessory structure, and then just impose the accessory structure setbacks. So we did that in one instance for our ground-mounted solar application. And other than BPU, all of those rooftop and that one ground-mounted application were all for individual energy production for the business or property owner. So moving forward, you know, one of the possibilities that we could look at is, I guess, a baseline approach. We could fairly easily put together an ordinance that approves kind of what our practice has been, as I just outlined, allowing rooftop solar applications as an accessory use in all zoning districts, so anyone could do rooftop solar. It's kind of what we've been doing just at the staff level, but we could make that clear in the code so that as people are doing their due diligence for solar and they're doing that online searching, they're not gonna see anything, so it doesn't say, welcome, bring your solar here. We can make that clear in the code if that's of interest. We could also look at allowing potentially ground-mounted solar for single family. I would encourage that if we go that route, we might want to consider some minimal regulations about impact to neighboring properties. If it's a big system and it's too close to a lot line, kind of the same types of things could apply potentially to, other accessory structures and why we have setbacks and placement in the yard, those kinds of things. And then I guess the other thing that we could potentially look at is other zoning districts. The thing that I would just caution is that we have to do a similar evaluation that we did in the public benefits for other zoning districts, because once you get into office, commercial, industrial zones, a lot of times to have, depending on the size of the property, you may have a larger system on the ground. And that larger system may have, a different visual impact than say a roof-mounted application. So we want to just definitely consider some of those impacts, setbacks from other properties. We also have commercial next to residential, we have office next to residential, and so you can end up similar to BPU, where you have the application of an array near property owners, homes, and other structures. So some other things for consideration there. In that baseline approach, we could also look at some other non-solar green improvements to the code. One thing that has come up 2 different times in Baxter in terms of formal applications was e-charging stations for solar vehicles. So we had, I think, the second solar e-charging station in the state, in the out of metro area. I believe that's what they told us when they came to Arrowwood Lodge. And when we received that request to put in a charging station there, we were, oh my gosh, this was just brand new, and we were, is this a fuel station? What are we looking at here? Ultimately, after doing a lot of research, we decided to approve that with an electrical permit because they fully screened it. They had some larger mechanical equipment they fully screened. So that's on the kind of northwest side of Arrowwood Lodge right now. And then more recently, we had another one requested and we approved with an electrical permit at Coles. So we have 2 e-charging facilities in Baxter that we approved with building and or electrical permits. So we could look at making sure the code's clear that we support those stations in the city. We could select what zones we want to put them in. It's probably most common that they would want to be in a commercial zone somewhere where people could spend some time shopping or going out to eat because they're going to have to wait while the vehicle's charged. Another one that we could look at, making clear in the code that we allow is geothermal. I don't think the city has any major zoning concerns, at least from a staff perspective, about geothermal because the improvements, when completed, are underground. We do have one system that we approved for single-family geothermal, and that was with a building permit application. So the city really doesn't, staff doesn't have any concerns with making sure that's clear that improvement's allowed. And then the other one is porous pavement. We've had several applications of porous pavement and different types of porous pavement. So we could look at making sure the code is clear that that we encourage those types of improvements. The one interesting thing about porous pavement, and some of the council will recall, there's porous concrete, there's porous asphalt. Many times it's like the consistency of like a Rice Krispie bar and how it looks. It's harder than that, but there's other types too. There's more aggregate based, where there's a lattice framework and then aggregate is put in. And when we got our only aggregate application, that was with the FOSS development, and the council decided to approve that as more of a test run and see how it performs. I think the city had some concern with, the gravel or the rock leaving the area and some other things we looked at with that, and we could easily revisit that and contact that property owner and just see how that's worked for them too. So those are some of the ones that I would say would be pretty easy for us to, without a lot of work, support with some sort of just baseline code amendments in various sections of the code. Another route the city could take is a more comprehensive ordinance. Some cities have elected to develop a whole chapter in the code to green energy and just cover it, everything. And I think most of the ones that we've been, I guess, most of the green energies that are out there have been requested of us. The only one that I think that we haven't really touched on is wind energy. So windmills, that would be another one if we did more of a comprehensive ordinance that we would want to take a look at. Of course, that one comes with a lot more factors for the city to consider. I think the reason we're probably not great candidates is due to how forested our city is. But it doesn't mean that that couldn't be proposed with with a request to get above the tree line with wind energy. So, but there are opportunities out there to seek a consultant. I think that's what staff would recommend, to do some sort of comprehensive green energy ordinance for the city if the council wants to do that, where we could get someone who's very comfortable with all of those different regulations to help us up with drafting an ordinance for the city's benefit. So it's just kind of an outline of just talking about green energy, mainly solar, but also getting into some of those other aspects. The city's willing to take this wherever the council wants to take it, and just to encourage any discussion that you want to have on the topic. But right now it's pretty minimal on what's formally listed as being allowed, except for that public benefit district.
Would it make sense to stick with the baseline approach, or develop that a little bit more, and then if you wanted to go to hiring a consultant first, see if there's grants available, and if there are, then go. I don't know.
Yeah.
Obviously I think it's a great opportunity, so it's the future, obviously.
Sure. Yeah, and there's no reason we can't start with one and do both. Or, if we knew grants were available and we were able to do the whole comprehensive ordinance, there probably is less need to go through the baseline approach, because everything would be covered in more of a comprehensive consultant hired grant type of scenario. But if it's something like where you prefer to just start with the baseline and kind of monitor it, then that would be more of an argument for the baseline. But we could certainly investigate the more comprehensive approach and come back to the council with what we found is out there, for opportunities and what the cost would be to get somebody on board to help us out with that.
Just have a couple of curiosity questions. So the ones that you have permitted on a house rooftop, do they lay flat, or do they elevate it at all, or do they almost always flat?
Yeah, the applications we've seen, they lay flat about right on top of the shingles.
Pretty sure.
They're out.
I didn't even know it.
They stick out a little bit from the roof, but they're following the roof line.
But they're not angled up.
Right.
Then the second thing is, since you brought it up, and maybe Trevor knows this already, but one of our concerns with the pervious surface was the gravel. Bringing where an MS4 said you had to sweep your streets, and it seems stupid. Have you noticed anything, Trevor, over there, or is it been an issue?
At the Foss development,
Jack Ross.
Haven't noticed anything, but we haven't went through a full season either with it. It'd be interesting to see what happens this spring for the cleaning of that surface.
Yeah.
Because when Janelle O'Reilly did it, at the office park, did a pervious pavement, she couldn't get it cleaned properly. It pretty much turned into impervious pavement after about 5 to 7 years. So that's kind of the problem in Minnesota.
You gotta vacuum that every year.
Yeah.
And then some of the reasons people were looking to use pervious pavement was to count it as green as opposed to the impervious part. So
that.
guess that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and at the staff level, we struggled with that because when we have 25% impervious surface requirement, that's a state law, the shoreline rules that protect our lakes and rivers. And how do you guarantee that that's gonna stay functioning at 100% porous surface? If they aren't maintained, they can clog. The way we would have, the way I would say we would recommend reviewing that, if that's used in that regard, is we're still gonna count it as hard surface, but it could be a good argument through the variance process as to why it is supported. So let's just say they were supposed to be at 25%, and the driveway would, if counted, would be under, but we're gonna say, no, you're at 30. But we're gonna say, look, they're at 30, but for all intents and purposes, they're making a good effort with this system to try to help. And here's a maintenance agreement that says they'll vacuum it once a year, whatever it is. So there's that. I think you're right. Everything I've learned about those systems, they do have to vacuum them, and that gets more challenging with the aggregate based. I think the other thing we're concerned about is that aggregate stay put? Does it travel, get into the stormwater systems? Does it, is there concern with vehicles, rollerbladers, slipping and tripping and falling? And so it got put around the back of that building where there's less of that traffic. So it'd probably be a good time to just check in with the property owner and see how that system's working for them and revisit that whole thing. But you're right, that would be, those systems aren't cheap, so they're normally requested to try to help themselves with some sort of code, unless they're just, their goal is to do green energy just because they want to do the right thing for the environment. So.
We spent a lot of time talking about it. I'm just curious if we ever went back and checked it out to see if it's working.
Yeah.
We did not check it last year, we probably will check it this year. But we haven't kept up on it. I know the other people that have used it have is Essentia.
Yeah. Yeah, essentially had porous asphalt.
Yeah. They took it out.
Yeah, they did take it out, but they had it. Back, not a while back, the code said if you're gonna be over the city required parking by so much, you had to add porous pavement, just to reduce that environmental impact. So I think that's why essentially they're adding that. Yeah.
We've tried a lot of green practices, whether it's energy or stormwater. I mean, some have been successful, some haven't. The islands, having the water drain into the islands, we've had a few that have done that. We've had some, one was a success, one wasn't. It all comes to maintenance. So kind of when you're talking solar or wind power, or any of those renewable energy, I mean, will they maintain the stuff, or what will it look like 10, 15 years from now? So just food for thought, throwing things out there. I mean, maybe like Baxter hasn't tried.
I'll just toss out that my whole idea was basically to codify what's already been going on. So if we wanted to go beyond that, that's fine by me. That was in short what I was looking for.
Anybody else?
Hearing that as a consensus to move based on the baseline approach that was outlined in Mr. Doty's memo.
Maybe one quick question on that would just be to make sure we're all on the same page as to what that actually means. I guess in my mind, that's rooftop solar everywhere without real meaningful restriction, just rooftop solar's okay, geothermal's okay. You had my notes, I don't know if you hit on it, solar thermal to me, my understanding of that is that's like a big panel on a wall, which would be okay in the sense that it's very much like a panel on the roof. E-charging everywhere is fine, porous surfacing, fine. I don't know if that's what everybody else heard. The wind thing,
charging stations, you were talking about them being solar? Was that just a slip?
That's a slip, I don't,
Okay.
no solar and e-charging.
Okay, because we're putting those in at camp.
Okay.
And, the other thing on solar panels that are raised off the roof, like on a commercial flat roof or whatever, is there some major structural issues there with additional snow drifting and snow drift loads, and we're finding we have to design the building to accommodate it. It just won't fit on top of any existing roof. So I'm not sure,
We would make sure we address that.
make sure that gets reviewed by the building inspector.
Yeah, for sure, yeah. The only other question then is, in the baseline approach, is the council interested in pursuing any kind of ground mounted solar for single family? And I guess one last question is, do you want to stretch that to other zoning districts? I think it gets more comprehensive if we move into the ground solar game, so to speak, because then we have to really consider a lot more. So it's not that we can't do it, it's gonna take more consideration, I think, to have a proper ordinance that protects the ability to do solar on the ground for the property owner that wants to do it, but also the neighboring property owners too, so.
I could jump in on one note. I, didn't fully study what went on before and what the current standards could be, but I thought, if nothing else, if you treated it a lot like a storage shed, that allowing whatever we're currently allowing in terms of general size, shape, and distance from property lines might be an acceptable option, but that was just off the cuff.
Sure.
Okay, the residential pole mounted unit is in my neighborhood, and it is right across the street. It's pretty much in their garden area, and there's quite a bit of screening between it and the street. So I think it's a little more of a screening issue than treating it like an accessory structure, because that just means it can be 10 feet from, I can put it 10 feet from your property line, right? It's just in the back area. So that one is more than 15 feet tall.
Yeah, it's big.
But it's not obtrusive because they have the screen. So it works out. But I think the key there is screening, making sure there's some screening.
So if I'm hearing correctly, the council's wanting to consider single family ground mounted as well, but we can leave the other districts out for now. It gets bigger, and I would kind of like lean towards the consultant mode if we're gonna get into all of the other districts, because you can get into some more situations where you're gonna have a raise. Because once you start getting into townhouses, apartments, and if they're wanting to do a ground mounted solar field, it's just gonna take up that much more area. A lot of the same factors that came up in BPU.
Oh, and you could theoretically take up the same land space as the houses to get enough panels.
Right.
To power the house. I'm not sure my neighbors would really like it if I went on the south side of my house and cut down all the trees, put up enough panels to run mine.
Well, and I would take it a step further. We have winter, so it's not necessarily gonna happen here, but there are national retailers that have changed their parking lot and put the solar arrays in their parking lot. So basically it's underground parking with the solar array above the vehicles. In that context, is that an aesthetically pleasing view? That I think that's what we were talking about from a staff standpoint is do you move in that direction and allow for that, where we need that consultant per se to guide us through that, to what we like and what we don't like, or do we want to allow for the one panel in the neighborhood area under with the conditions? And that's kind of what we were talking about, is it gets more complex once you get outside that individual use. When you're getting to that point, they start to become complex systems, and they can become an architectural feature. So.
Careful how you word They're all producing commercial
Understand.
power.
Yeah. I think the idea is just simply what Brad said, it just gets more complex if you're starting to do multi-pole arrays on the ground or suspended in the air over a parking lot. There's all sorts of different applications people could propose in our city that I think we need to have the proper ordinance in place before we allow those, and where we would probably want to just get some more assistance with those that have written those codes before, is all we're saying, if you want to take it that direction.
I guess the more we've talked about it, the more I'm feeling like that sounds like something to at least consider. Because I know, like, my baseline opinion is parking lots are inherently not aesthetically pleasing. So if they're covered in solar panels or not isn't very relevant to me. So if somebody wanted to, I'd be one to lean towards allowing that. But I don't even know if that's something that would happen in Minnesota.
But I would ask, you know, if you do a ground mounted in all sorts of zoning districts, you could get someone that cuts 40 acres and does solar panels along the highway. You know, how do you differentiate between,
Those are two
different
things
situations,
to consider,
so,
yes.
yeah.
Using a potentially residential land or potentially industrial land for that is a different value proposition.
Okay, anything else? Thanks for your,
So baseline approach, are you guys comfortable with the baseline approach and looking at single family then for ground?
I think so.
Okay. And
Are we talking single pole ground?
yeah,